Чи можна вибрати
Is it possible to choose among griefs the one that touches you the most? Russians have abducted about 200,000-300,000 children. They were not going to and are not going to return them home. They do everything to prevent us from finding the children. Ukrainians are not victims. Ukrainians are fighters.
Росіяни комунікують зараз
The
найвищу
Russians are now communicating the highest figure 744,000 evacuated or rescued children. But in fact, abducted, forcibly displaced, and deported. At least, this was confirmed by the International Criminal Court, which issued arrest warrants against Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova for the crimes of deportation and forced displacement of civilians, including children. Yes, they were suspected of committing war crimes. Actually, this is at least a confirmation and proof of the fact, at least one fact of the genocide of the Ukrainian people, which has already been recorded and confirmed. So today, despite the fact that Russia is communicating such a large number, they have not confirmed this figure to anyone, neither to the Ukrainian side, nor to a third country, nor to any international structure or organization. According to our calculations, this figure is significantly exaggerated. Reducing the figure announced by the Russian Federation does not diminish their crime. The point is that if the Russians kidnapped even only one child, it would be an absolute crime, an absolute evil that they have committed against Ukrainian children. Whom do they count? How do they count these children? Where do they get these numbers from? I cannot and do not want to explain or comment. Today, we suppose that the Russians have abducted about 200,000-300,000 children. This is what they could have done. Why? We cannot give an exact figure, because part of the territory of Ukraine is still occupied and, accordingly, we do not have access there, and we don't know exactly what has happened to the children, or is still happening now. But we understand that approximately this number of children could have been abducted, because they were actually in the temporarily occupied territories. As for the exact number we have today, it is more than 19,400 names of Ukrainian children. This is a list, a register of deported and forcibly displaced children based on appeals from their relatives, parents, local authorities, and also witnesses who know for sure that the child was deported or forcibly displaced. In fact, this register is completely based on these appeals. Of course, as I've previously mentioned, these figures are not final, precisely because the Ukrainian territories are still occupied and we do not know exactly what happened to the Ukrainian children. We do not divide the numbers into two specific categories, so you understand that these are two different categories. Deportees are those whom the Russian authorities abducted from the territory of Ukraine and moved to the territory of the Russian Federation or the territory of the Republic of Belarus. There are also such facts. And forcibly displaced children are those who were forcibly moved from one occupied territory of Ukraine to another temporarily occupied territory of Ukraine. For example, the Luhansk and Donetsk regions and the Crimea. And what about the location? Now we cannot say that this number of children has been deported and this number has been forcibly displaced because the Russians are constantly moving Ukrainian children. They can take them to the temporarily occupied territory, then move to the Russian Federation, then return them back to the occupied territory, and so on. They do everything to prevent us from finding the children. That's why they are constantly moving them. There is no single location on the territory of the Russian Federation. They are scattering them. Therefore, unfortunately, we cannot say for sure where our children are. First, I must confess that Russia has a well-planned genocidal policy against Ukrainian children. The implementation of this policy did not begin from the full-scale invasion. It started in 2014 when the Russians annexed Crimea. They immediately launched the so-called Train of Hope, which brought Russian citizens to the annexed Crimea to illegally adopt Ukrainian children. So from that time, these actions have already started. Nowadays, the Russians have a wider range of methods, ways, and situations which they use to abduct Ukrainian children. They have more territories. In addition, they have those which they have already temporarily occupied. We've managed to return 369 children. We studied their stories after they returned, and we cannot say that these children's stories have a happy ending, but also what they saw with their own eyes when their parents have died. Some of them are still waiting for their parents, who were separated during the so-called filtration procedures. That is why we cannot say that the children are doing well when they are back. But these 369 stories gave us a possibility to analyze the actions of the Russian occupiers against Ukrainian children. There are at least 5 scenarios of abduction. We have already analyzed them and are still investigating the 6th scenario. The Russians have the first scenario, when they first kill the parents and then kidnap the children. These are stories, for example, of Kira and Ilya, whom we have returned to Ukraine, whose parents died right in front of their eyes. Kira's father went to get some water and was killed, and she saw that. Ilya's mother died in his arms. She had been shot in the head. The second scenario is when Russians take children directly from their biological families. Occupants often take parental rights from parents. They choose inconvenient parents who do not want to cooperate with the occupation authorities. So they are deprived of parental rights as inconvenient, and their children are taken away. Or children are taken away from other relatives with whom the children lived and could continue to live, with older brothers and sisters, if there are no parents, with grandparents or other relatives. The third scenario is when Russians separate children from their parents during the so-called filtration procedure. Sometimes parents manage to get free and then manage to take their children out of the Russian Federation. This is a fairly well-known case of Yevhen and his 3 children from Mariupol, who were separated during the filtration procedure. But then Yevhen managed to get free and took his children from the Russian Federation. He did this just a few days before they were to be sent to a foster Russian family. Actually, the fourth case, the fourth situation, is when the Russians create conditions that are completely unsuitable for children to live in the temporarily occupied territories. They cause an absolute humanitarian crisis, do not allow the Ukrainian side to take children from institutional care facilities where they were kept around the clock, and then these children are abducted. And the fifth scenario is perhaps the most widespread. This is when, due to unsuitable living conditions, parents allegedly voluntarily, but in reality, it is not voluntarily, sign their children, signing documents to so-called rest in Russian camps to save their children. According to the documents, the child should be returned in 2-3 weeks. But of course, the child is not returned. He or she stays there for 6 months or a year. There are some children whom we managed to return a year after such camps, because they were moved from one camp to another and so on. Often parents are coerced by threats that if they do not give up their child, allegedly voluntarily, they will be deprived of parental rights and will never see their child again. Of course, parents make a choice to preserve the chance to save their child. They sign these documents. And there is a sixth scenario that we are currently exploring. Russians conduct so-called mandatory medical examinations in the temporarily occupied territories, and suddenly a perfectly healthy child gets a strange diagnosis that requires treatment or rehabilitation in the Russian Federation. That is how they take the child away. Because they threaten the parents, if you don't want to treat your child, then you should be deprived of parental rights. This is approximately the scenario the Russians have. This is what we know for sure. It is clear why they would like to have our children. First, I have already mentioned that this is genocide. And everything they do with Ukrainian children is not only abduction, it is sexual violence. And today we have 14 documented cases of sexual violence. The youngest victim of sexual violence is 4 years old. We have cases of killed and wounded children. Cases of children whom the Russians simply shot for fun and did not give them back. They did not allow anyone to enter the car with the shot children while they were alive. They did not allow anyone for 2 hours. They just enjoyed watching the children crying, wheezing, and dying. They did not allow anyone to help them. Only after 2 hours they allowed somebody to come to them when the children were already dead. So what is this? This is nothing less than genocide. They want to destroy the Ukrainian nation. For the Ukrainian nation, for any other nation, their children are a treasure. Children are our future. They are trying to erase our future by abducting our children to the Russian Federation. They are trying to fill their nation using our children. Actually, these diagnoses I've previously mentioned are established during medical examinations. These diagnoses are made to children who are the healthiest. In fact, they simply select children and take those that they want. And everything that happens to the children after the abduction indicates that the Russians were not going to return them home and are not going to. Therefore, this is not an evacuation. And this is exactly what Ukraine has been saying from the very beginning. It is deportation and forced displacement. It is the abduction of Ukrainian children. Because the Russians immediately changed the adoption procedure and simplified the procedure for obtaining Russian citizenship for Ukrainian children. What is the purpose of all this? To keep the children with them. That's all. All the children, immediately after they fell into the clutches of the Russian military or the Russian authorities, were told that they were not needed by their parents, their relatives. They were told that no one would take them back home and that they would have a bright future in the Russian Federation, in a Russian family. Even if a child said that they had relatives, that they knew the phone number and asked them to call to tell them where they were, they refused. First, let's understand how difficult it is to return Ukrainian children. The first step is to know who you are returning. Today, we know a little over 19,400 names. This is not 200,000 or 300,000 yet, so we do not know all the information. The second issue is to find where they are. This is also a problem because the Russians are doing everything they can to hide their tracks. And the next problem is that there is no single mechanism or algorithm for the return of Ukrainian children. Those procedures that should work in theory have not worked in practice. For example, the International Committee of the Red Cross has the strongest mandate in this field, but it did not succeed. That is why we understand that the return procedure is so slow. Yes, today there are 369 children, because every time it is almost a separate operation to rescue a child or a small group of children. That is why it is so slow. Now we are developing new algorithms and new mechanisms for Ukrainian children to return, looking for these opportunities, involving the entire international community in the search for these exits and ways. In fact, we are doing this not only for Ukrainian children, but for every child in the world, because we are building a global new system of safety for the children in the whole world. So far, we have not managed to return a single child who had gone through the adoption procedure. So far, we have managed to return children who were in foster care. Often they did not want to give them back. There was a struggle between the biological family and the foster family. Russians act like a maniac in a simple way. They kidnap Ukrainian children and say, "I decided that it's better for this child to stay with me. I love him or her more because I decided so. I will give a better education, a better apartment, and I will feed him or her better. That's why the child should stay with me." And no matter what anyone says, they say, "No, I have decided." That is simply the behavior of a maniac. When children return, when we are able to return them, an individual assessment of the rehabilitation needs of each child takes place. For each child, it is individual. It depends on their age, on the territory from which they were abducted. Is it a child who was taken from his parents and taken away for a vacation? Or is it a child whose mom or dad died in front of him or her, and then he or she was abducted, and the child could not communicate with his or her biological family at all? Everything depends on the individual. Therefore, the needs of each child are assessed. Not only a psychological assessment, but also a medical examination. And if the child needs treatment, he or she is treated. Then, accordingly, their educational needs are assessed, as well as any humanitarian needs, ranging from a cell phone to clothes, because sometimes situations are different. Psychological examination and testing are mandatory, and then it is determined what a particular child needs and how long the rehabilitation will last. I think you know about the Unified State Information Platform Children of War, and there are numbers there. It's a terrible counter. I hate mornings. I just hate mornings, because every morning at 8 o'clock, these numbers are updated. I realize that behind every number that has increased, if we are talking about children who died, it is not just a number, it is just the finished, cut short, taken away life of a child, of the whole universe, because every child is a whole universe. Every story has its own tragedy, of course. The tragedy is when Sasha looks in my eyes every time he talks to me, and repeats it 10 times during the conversation. Could you believe they didn't even let me say goodbye to my mom? He repeats this 10 times during the conversation. It is scary when children tell stories about the Russian military during their captivity. And we have such children too. There is Vlad, who was in captivity for 90 days. There is Vitaly, who was held captive by the Russians for 10 days. These children tell terrible things. Vitaly, who says that now he cannot take a shower because he cannot put his feet in the wet. He remembers falling asleep in his cell and waking up from a shot, and then realizing that his feet were on something wet. It was the blood of a man who was killed in the neighboring cell. It flowed under the door and soaked his feet. In front of Vlad's eyes, a 24-year-old guy who was in the cell with him was cutting his veins. And Vlad just sat there with him. He said, "Can you imagine? I couldn't do anything." And he realized that it was so hard for him, that this was the only way out, that you just sit with him and wait for him to die, and you talk to him. I mean, he's cutting his wrists, and you're sitting with him talking, and you're 16 years old. And I asked him, "How did you survive? How did you get up in the morning? What helped you survive all this?" I asked both Vitaly and Vlad. Vitaly said, "I was afraid to show them that I was afraid." And Vlad said, "They could not see that I doubted that I would survive. I had to believe that I would survive, that they wouldn't kill me, and that I would be able to come back." Sashko said that he was very afraid that he would not be able to wait for his mother, that he would be sent further, that he would not be able to return. And that's scary. It's all very scary. Sasha, an 8-year-old girl who had her leg amputated after a rocket exploded, who returned to rhythmic gymnastics. And she says to me, "Look how I can do it now with the prosthesis. And it doesn't hurt at all." Is it possible to choose among griefs, the one that touches you the most? In fact, children who were in Russian camps have a very strong sense of guilt. They don't talk about it. They consider themselves guilty. Very often, children feel guilty because they did not find a way to escape, to inform their families where they were, because they did not get a phone, because they could not do it right in time. Children actually have a very big sense of guilt. It's terrible because they cannot be blamed for anything. It's never the victim's fault. Just as victims of sexual violence often feel guilty. They are supposedly not dressed in the right way or behaved in the wrong way, didn't fight back, couldn't do it, and so on. And in fact, the victim is always innocent. Ukrainians are not victims. Ukrainians are fighters. These are different things, but children are definitely innocent. They are children, children's eyes, children's voices. It's scary that there are a lot of children's voices that will never be heard again. That's the worst thing. That's why I'm afraid of losing my voice. Because I want to sound like these children's voices. I want them to continue to speak, to tell their stories, and for the whole world to know about them. So perhaps I am most afraid of losing my voice.